pairs of them. Two that pull the hyoid bone upwards and forwards, one that pulls it upwards and backwards, one that pulls it upwards by means of a pulley, and three that pull it downwards. We'll start with the two that pull upwards and forwards, the mylohyoid and geniohyoid muscles. Here are the two mylohyoid muscles. Between them they form a continuous sling of muscle that forms the mobile floor of the oral cavity. The mylohyoid muscle arises from the mylohyoid line on the mandible. Most of its fibers pass downwards and medially, joining in the midline with the fibers from the opposite side, all the way from the symphysis of the mandible to the body of the hyoid bone. The more posterior fibers of the mylohyoid insert here on the body of the hyoid bone. The mylohyoid muscle has a free posterior border, which runs straight downwards when seen from the side, also a little inward when seen from behind. Now we'll add the two geniohyoid muscles to the picture. Here they are. They lie above the mylohyoid. On each side, the geniohyoid arises from the lower part of the mental spine. It inserts here on the body of the hyoid bone. Now we'll bring the base of the skull into the picture and add the muscle that pulls upwards and backwards, the stylohyoid. Here's the stylohyoid. It's a long, slender muscle. Just above its insertion, there's an opening in the stylohyoid. The digastric muscle passes through this opening, as we'll see. The stylohyoid arises from the lateral aspect of the styloid process. It's inserted on the base of the greater horn of the hyoid bone. Next we'll add the digastric muscle to the picture. Here it is. The digastric muscle is unusual in that it has two bellies, an anterior and a posterior, that are connected in the middle by a tendon. The posterior belly of the digastric arises here from the digastric notch on the underside of the temporal bone and from the medial aspect of the mastoid process. The origins of the sternocleidomastoid and splenius muscles, which have been removed in this dissection, lie lateral to it. The posterior belly narrows to a tendon which passes between the two slips of the stylohyoid. The digastric tendon then passes through a sling of fibrous connective tissue by which it's tethered to the hyoid bone here. The tendon then broadens out into the anterior belly of the digastric, which runs almost straight forward beneath the mylohyoid. It's attached low down on the inner aspect of the body of the mandible, just lateral to the midline. Lastly, we'll take a brief look at the attachments of the three muscles that pull the hyoid bone downwards. They're the omohyoid, sternohyoid, and thyrohyoid muscles, known collectively as the infrahyoid muscles. Here's the body of the hyoid bone. Here's the upper end of the omohyoid muscle, which goes all the way down to the scapula. Medial to it is the sternohyoid muscle, which goes to the sternum. Behind these two is the short thyrohyoid muscle, which goes down to a structure we haven't seen yet, the thyroid cartilage. These muscles insert on the edge of the body of the hyoid bone, the thyrohyoid here, the omohyoid here, and the sternohyoid here. We'll see these three muscles more fully later in this tape. The infrahyoid muscles pull the hyoid bone downwards. Acting together with the digastric muscle, the infrahyoid muscles assist in opening the jaw. The actions of the other hyoid muscles that we've seen are evident from the direction of their fibers. Now that we've seen the hyoid bone and the muscles that hold it in place and move it, we'll move on to look at the tongue. The shape of the mobile anterior part of the tongue is familiar to us from everyday encounters. What's perhaps surprising is how much of the tongue we don't see from in front. The tongue goes a long way back and a long way down. To understand the overall shape of the tongue, let's look at a specimen that's been divided in the midline. All this is the tongue, right back to here. The tongue consists almost entirely of muscle, covered by specialized mucous membrane. The freely mobile anterior part of the tongue almost fills the oral cavity. The massive posterior part of the tongue, which is much less mobile, faces backwards into the oropharynx. This structure below and behind the back of the tongue is the epiglottis. We'll see it in the next section. To get a look at the intact tongue, we'll look at a specimen consisting of just the tongue, the mandible, and the hyoid bone. Here's the mylohyoid muscle. The body of the hyoid bone is here. Here's the greater horn. We'll look at the outside of the tongue first. The tongue is covered with mucous membrane on top, on the sides, and also here in front on the underside. The mucous membrane of the tongue is continuous with the mucous membrane that covers the floor of the mouth and the alveolar process. There's a deep valley between the alveolar process and the side of the tongue. This projecting fold in the midline is the frenum. On either side of it, the submandibular ducts open, as we'll see later. The mucous membrane over the root of the tongue is thin and mobile. Over the sides and the upper surface, the mucous membrane is thick, firmly attached to the underlying muscle, and covered by projections, called papillae. The largest of these, the valleculate papillae, are in a row back here. This shallow pit in the midline is the foramen cecum. The muscles that form the bulk of the tongue are intrinsic muscles, which run from one part of the tongue to another, and extrinsic muscles, which are attached to bone. There are 3 extrinsic muscles on each side. Of these, the 2 largest, which we'll see now, are hyoglossus and genioglossus. The other one, styloglossus, we'll see later. To get a view of the major extrinsic muscles, we'll divide the mandible along this line and remove the ramus and the alveolar process. We'll also remove all of the mucous membrane from this line downwards. Here are the hyoglossus and genioglossus muscles, which together form the root of the tongue. To see the full extent of genioglossus, we'll remove hyoglossus for a moment. All this is genioglossus. Genioglossus arises just above the geniohyoid from the upper part of the mental spine. Its fibers fan out, the highest ones arching forward almost to the tip of the tongue, the lowest ones running straight backward to the most posterior part of the tongue. Genioglossus compacts the tongue and pulls it forwards. Now we'll put hyoglossus back in the picture. Hyoglossus is a thin, flat sheet of muscle. Its fibers run upwards and forwards. Hyoglossus arises from the whole length of the greater horn of the hyoid bone. Here's the greater horn, and ends here, along the side of the tongue. Hyoglossus flattens the tongue and pulls it backwards and downwards. Here alongside hyoglossus is the 3rd extrinsic tongue muscle, styloglossus, coming in from behind. We'll see it later. Here's the mylohyoid muscle, seen from behind. The space between the mylohyoid and hyoglossus muscles is the pathway for the nerves to the tongue and the submandibular duct, as we'll see in the next tape. The intrinsic muscles of the tongue, which we won't look at in detail, run both longitudinally and transversely above and between the extrinsic muscles. They're responsible for many of the fine movements that are involved in handling food and in speech. We've looked at a lot of muscles in this section: the muscles of mastication, the muscles of the hyoid bone, and the extrinsic tongue muscles. Later in this section, when we look at the salivary glands and at the pharynx, we'll have a chance to see how all the muscles fit together that we've seen up to now. Before we move on, let's review the structures that we've seen so far in this section.